Okay, let's get started. It's 1 o'clock, it's Tuesday, and as always, that means only one thing. It's another HDF clinic. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to pause here. I checked our Google document. I didn't see any questions there, but I'm going to pause for those of you who joined here today. Are there any questions at the moment? No? Okay, good. Then we'll just press on. Last week's highlights, announcements, nothing in particular, but then again, registration is open, registration for attendance, but also registration if you would like to give a presentation or a talk is open for our European HDF users group event, which is going to be last day in May and the first 2 days in June. So please consider visiting in person to get the great tour of the EDA facility, or participate online, give a presentation. That's great. And okay, that's as far as announcements go. And then I'm going to pause. There was a lot going on in the forum, but I'm going to pause and see, are there any questions?
No questions, Gerd.
Okay, thanks. Welcome. Okay, yeah, lots of traffic on the forum. And again, this is just sort of my selection, what stood out to me. I think Stephen had an interesting post. He was asking in H5CPP, as sort of the C++ fans know, he has very nice facilities for persisting, meaning using HDF5, STL based structures in HDF5, and he was just interested in hearing from the community which combinations of containers and so forth people use. And unfortunately, I mean, when I checked earlier today, there weren't that many responses. I don't know how to interpret that, but people are busy. But anybody who uses the STL and is interested in sort of persisting pretty much stuff as is. So the beauty, I think, of H5CPP there is you can just call H5CPP write and then write it to HDF5. You don't have to agonize and think about, oh, how am I going to represent this in HDF5 and so forth. And that's really the beauty of it for standard containers. And so if you haven't looked at this, I would encourage you, and it's really nice. Okay, then there was an interesting post about what looks really like a bug, where somebody was constructing a compound type. So compound type, basically a record type, if you want to call it that, where you have fields and each field is of a certain HDF5 data type. And what they noticed was that the what failed was when they tried, and they posted a reproducer there, is if they created an enumerated type and then did not define any constants. So an enumerated type is basically, yeah, named integer constants. That's what it is about. And but you can construct an empty enumerated type where you just say, okay, here's my integer, my base type, but then do not include any string constants. And if they take such and call it this an empty enumerated type, and they try to insert that as a field into that compound type, that's when the error occurred. And yeah, to me, this looks like a bug, and I'm sure we'll do something about it. And Elena, please go ahead.
Okay, I raised my hand. I was trying to raise my hand. It rings a bell. I think it is not a bug, it's a feature. We can dig through old emails, but library requires that that enumeration type is completely defined, which meaning you have to define what was not defined. And there was, it may be in old forum or in old help desk. And the answer was, no, it is a feature. Should we fix it? Maybe, but at that point it was considered that no, you have to define completely. I may try to find this, but it rings a bell from old years.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting comment because I mean, again, it's one of these where you could go either way. You could say an
Mhm.
empty enumerated type is as good an enumerated type as one that has only one constant or 10 constants. And
Mhm.
but yeah, I could see you could argue and say, well, it's not really of any use. So how many different ways do you want to define something that's useless? How many possibilities do you want to create something that's useless? And on that angle, you might say, no, this should be an error or at least a warning.
Right. And it may be very well related to how conversion functions and encoding is implemented
Yeah.
when it goes into storage.
Okay. Thanks for the comment. Yeah. I'm going to pause here. Somebody joined. Do you have a question or are there any questions? Because this is clinic, this is all about the audience asking questions. No? Okay, good. Then we'll just continue. Okay, this was a very interesting post. The title looks kind of innocent, but it was very interesting work, I think, that should be part of our testing. Again, finding ways of really sort of pushing the library into corners, so to speak. So my understanding is what the user was doing as part of a research project or a thesis was really, yeah, take the API and then for attribute names, link names, and or object names, and the values of string data types or attribute values, just generate arbitrary byte sequences and then feed those wherever there is a string argument in the library. And what that person found was that, yeah, in some cases the library would create an HDF5 file. However, then certain tools were sometimes unable to open the file. They had trouble iterating over links or iterating over attributes and so forth. So I would say definitely mission accomplished. And here's just a screenshot that the user provided that shows one of these examples. Of course, you can see that I think the user said that he or she just took I think a Keras, like a machine learning, something that represented the training state of a neural network. And then they just massaged that file in the sense that, yeah, they just changed attribute names or added new content to it. And I think that's what we see here, model weights. So that could be from a neural network or something like that. But then anyway, so yeah, it would be interesting to see. I mean, one of the not concerns but considerations is, of course, that let's say when you use arbitrary byte sequences, not every arbitrary byte sequence represents a string. Let's say we are using UTF-8 encoded strings where we have the full set of Unicode characters or Unicode symbols or code points, I think is the correct nomenclature. So there are certain byte sequences that do not represent UTF-8 encoded Unicode code points. And so that would be one consideration. And then, of course, if the metadata in the file is not stored correctly, so you told the library this is going to be an ASCII string or something like that, and Elena will correct me in a moment, but to my knowledge, the library does not check whether you are using ASCII or UTF-8 encoded library. The library just takes that byte array, and as long as the sizes make sense, it will not touch your data. It will not check, is this really an ASCII string or is this really a UTF-8 encoded Unicode string? But that's a minor technical detail. I'm sure this user uncovered certain corner cases where the library just is buggy. It just does not behave correctly.
Again, I just want to ask, because I
Mhm.
saw that post and I didn't quite understand. Did he really, when he saw, for example, he can dump with some ED or something, or file content, right, and see strings will be displayed, and he replaced those strings with some other strings? That's what he did? What he really did?
I think, what he did is he had an existing HDF5 file, so he didn't create it completely from scratch. And then he just added attributes and data, or attributes and groups to that existing HDF5 file, with the trick that for the attribute names and for the link names or group names, he just used arbitrary random strings, which is fine.
So he used libraries. So he did. He didn't modify manually the file. He did it.
No. He used H5Py. That's my understanding. He used H5Py and just added sort of stuff to it. And so,
Right, and HDF5 library will display, since it does know, apparently he didn't specify, no, Python will do everything in UTF-8. So create the UTF-8. So library should display that UTF-8 string. This should be displayed correctly.
Right. But it's not so much. This is just an HDF view screenshot. Right. But remember, H5Py, for example, treats variable length strings and fixed length strings differently, because in Python you have sort of the string types, which are fixed size Python arrays, let's say, and then you have byte arrays, which is how variable length sequence type strings are represented. And so I don't know, when you create a group or an attribute in H5Py, how these strings are actually handled. I mean, UTF-8 encoded strings work fine, but I don't know if the Python API would complain, especially the low-level API. You just give it a byte array and say it was UTF-8 encoded, and then H5Py will say, fine, I take your word for it. And
Right, so what is there is what was fed to it. So where is the problem? That's what I mean.
Oh, no, the problem is that when he then tried to, I think, run H5 dump on it, in some cases, the tool would just fail and say, I can't really iterate over this group. So the super block was fine, and it was able to open the root group, but then it would encounter link names that it either, and it could be that by accident, either some library internal data structures were overwritten, or again, I don't know if he used, theoretically, the library should detect it. If you have slashes, well, in attribute name, you can have a slash, that's perfectly fine. But in a link name, of course, a slash is not a legitimate character in a link name.
You know, H5 dump definitely cannot handle UTF-8 strings, I think. It is, it depends on, it is just prints whatever is there. We need to get to the bottom of it. I don't understand, because it should display some junk, but it shouldn't choke. I remember, yes, you're right, because there was a, that it cannot iterate. So somehow he really messed up the file.
So here he said, this is the output from HDF view, and here's from H5 dump, the stack trace. And it really goes all the way down to the symbol table. So here's visit by name, where somehow he's traversing the object structure. And
if he fed any, well, we need to see how he modified the file. So I agree with you that it is something was in that link name that library couldn't interpret for some reason. But it's really weird, because it.
Because I remember I asked him later, and he said, I'm sure, blah, 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 fuzzer, My fuzzer is only creating groups, data sets, and attributes with the file using create group, create data set, and dot attributes. So
Legitimate way to do it. No, it's
yeah.
yeah, it's better. Yeah, I agree. It needs to understand. You know, we need to understand. It's not right. My gut feeling is something is wrong.
Right. But it could also be that there is just a bug in the API, and it's not clear at this point, since we are relying on tools, if the bug is in the library or in the tool, because the tools would also do certain types of normalizations and so forth. But then on the other hand, the hour trace really goes down to the sort of to the symbol table, and so it's probably not a tool error, plain and simple. There's probably more.
If he can read and iterate with H5 API, right?
And he probably can't, or yeah. If he can't do it with H5 dump, then yeah, he probably wouldn't.
Oh no, H5 may display those strings as whatever he fed it from H5.
Yeah, but then again, in the error message it talks about the corrupt heap and whatnot, and I think H5 couldn't gloss over that, because at the end of the day, even if it's UTF-8 encoded, you have to be able to sort of scrape the bytes of the heap and then
I agree.
decode them, and Anyway, but it was definitely an interesting feat of engineering, and we should see if there's something we can benefit from that for our test suite and so forth, and to make it more robust. And okay, next one up. Oh, this was another one from Sweet. Again, I think he's definitely leading the pack there with once you have these sort of composites of standard STL, standard template library data structures, of course, a lot of us have found themselves writing iterators and whatnot to traverse these structures to then print out what's there. But then again, Stephen has shown that you can pretty much automate that process and have the compiler sort of generate the right print routine for you. And this is just an example of it. So again, if you are interested in that, have a look. And I think it's great work. Next one up was group overhead. This is a little bit interesting. Somebody said something, okay, we have this object tree and we are trying to map it into an HDF5 file. And they found that the group overhead, not really very specific, but their impression was that just adding another group or something took 2 to 20 kilobytes, and they were concerned, considering how many groups they were planning on putting into their representation, that would just blow up their space budget, so to speak. But yeah, the interesting question was really, there was no elaboration on how they measured it. And so Stephen posted an interesting example, John Reedy for HSDS, and I also chimed in. It's really, well, first of all, you have to think about what is in a group. And once you've settled that, then you can think about, well, how much space can that possibly take? But this figure is definitely too high. We found that Steve wrote an interesting program where he basically created random numbers of links in a group with random links, and he found that on average about 700 bytes, and that's with the oldest version of the file format. And then I had a little Python script in there where I showed, if you used a newer version of the file format, that you could reduce that by a factor of 10 almost. And so so this figure really looks unusually high. And so that's but then the user hasn't replied yet, so we don't really know if they realized they made a mistake or something like that. Okay, here's another good one. It was bug week, or who knows what else is to come later in the week. This was a good post. Somebody use that function h5p set estimated link info. So the idea here is that when you have a group, this is for a group creation property list, you can tell the HDF5 library and say, I know that I typically have this many entries, this many links in this group, and I know that the name, the length of the name is so many bytes, or it doesn't exceed that. And that's, of course, a good way. If you can provide that type of information, then the library can, in a way, pre-allocate space, in a way, be a little more proactive and amortize some of the allocation or reallocation overhead. And so what these testers found was that for very reasonable values, so in this function, there are basically two arguments, as I said, the link count, or the estimated link count, and the estimated link name size. They used very reasonable values. I think 500 for the count and about 100 for the length of the link name. And it created this 64K, this ominous 64K header message size limitation. And this is always ominous, because we know that at some point we introduced this compact versus dense group storage. And what happens in this case, it appears is, and the documentation, that's why I put it here, there is a sentence that looks a little strange in the documentation that basically says, well, if you expect a lot without specifying what a lot really means, the documentation says, if you expect a lot of link names, then just put 0 for that count, for the estimated link count, and specify the length to the best of your knowledge, because then the library will not try compact storage, it will go straight to dense storage. And so what happens in this case, the library is confused by that first argument, 500, and I think the user actually provided an example. It was like, I'm making this up, 500, 499 worked and 500 failed. So for some reason that triggered this threshold where the library thought, oh, up to this point, the library thought, I'm going to do this in compact or something like that, and things just worked out. But then once you get past it, there is an error in the logic that still tries to do this compactly somehow, although dense storage would be required. And yeah, so good news is somebody found it, it's a bug, and we'll fix it. But that was a good find, and I'm surprised, yeah, that our test suite didn't catch that. But yeah, there's always something new. Okay, and then we had one more. I'm just looking at the time here, because yeah, I want to also get to our tips and tricks, at least to one, which I found fascinating. This was just, yes, somebody had a corrupted file during shutdown, somebody using H5Pi, they thought the process was maybe killed, and then yeah, you are left with the pieces. And the user actually showed that H5 dump and H5 debug couldn't really do very much. Again, we've talked about this in a previous episode. What I would do is use a good old household tool like strings to basically find the offsets where the strings themselves, but if you specify -td for decimal, you will get the offset of the strings in a file. And then that gives you a good idea in terms of your chances to recover anything, because then you will see these 4-letter ASCII strings like S0 for symbol node, or tree for B tree, or OH, depending on which format you use, OHDR for an object header, and so forth. And then you will have the offsets. And then if you use a tool like H5 check, you can then sort of jump to that offset and look at what's there, and then you will, if the user said they know exactly what the data type was and the geometry or the shape of that data set. So then you might have a chance to actually recover something. But yeah, so nothing else. But yeah, we'll see if the user replies back. So then I have some tips and tricks, but I'm going to pause because this is not a monologue. Are there any questions?
No questions, Gerd.
Okay, great. Okay, then here's something, because we are running out of time, but I wanted to show you one thing that I find really fascinating, and my thanks go to Andy Gotts at ESRF, who pointed me at this. It's the second thing. I'm sort of, a demo is worth 1,000 words. So here, don't pay attention to this presentation here. That's part of this demo, but pay attention to what it says down here. It says, choose a local file. And in this case, of course, we would choose an HDF5 file. And I'm going to choose an HDF5 file. I have one here, which is actually, last time we had a gentleman asking about MODIS or EOS files. This is not a MODIS file, but it's also an EOS file. So I'm going to open that file, and lo and behold, this just opens it. So what is happening here behind the scenes? Okay, this file is, I think, 50 megabytes or something like that. Even if I had a very fast internet connection, uploading 50 megabytes sort of at the snap of a finger would be pretty darn fast. But in this case, that's not what happens. What happens is actually, and that's where this WebAssembly technology comes in, is in HTML5, in the HTML5 standard, there was a thing called a file system introduced, which means that in the browser, in the sandboxed environment that your browser is, if it works the way it's supposed to, meaning it's sandboxed from the rest of the environment, you can have nevertheless a file system in that browser sandbox. And so when I uploaded, I chose this file and uploaded this file, all that happened actually, it was copied into that browser sandbox. And then what these guys did here in this H5 WebAssembly project is, by the way, this is somebody at NIST who took the HDF5 library and basically put JavaScript or TypeScript bindings around it. And so that's what this does. And so why I'm so fascinated by this is something that I always wanted to do for our web page, for example. When users come to our web page, they have an HDF5 file and they may not have an idea, well, what am I going to do with this file? Sure, they can download HDF View or tools and so forth, but wouldn't it be great if they could just take that file and drag and drop it, or just upload it, so to speak? Although, again, uploading would create the additional concern. Now that file is leaving my environment, I have to copy it somewhere, rather than just keeping it in your local environment and then have sort of a browser-based view. And then, yeah, this is this H5 Web tool, or this React framework that the people at ESRF developed. This is what this first bullet is about, but we are running out of time, so I don't have, I'll come back to that next time. But so this WebAssembly project basically then uses H5 Web to create this visualization. And there are some limitations. There are some limitations. For example, I'm just going to pick one data set in here. What you will see popping up, I hope, in a moment. Yeah, it says, for example, the data set is too big to be displayed. I think this is something that can be fixed, but at least you can then switch to this inspection view where, okay, it tells us this is a 2400 square, so a pretty decent size grid and so forth. And I don't know what the limitations of the sort of the React component are that can't render this, but I'm sure this is something that can be fixed and so forth. But nevertheless, this the capability or the ability to just sort of go through this and see the group structure and yeah, see details about types, and so here the HDF EOS version. And so I think this is really great. And hey, as I sort of keep reminding myself, there's no shortage of talent and sort of great work being done out there in the community. And so this is always something we wanted. This is something we always wanted, and somebody's done it. So it's all we have to do is just pick it up and incorporated into our web page, and yeah, it's going to be great. And then yeah, the next step is, of course, let's say if the file were remote, of course you could first download it and then copy it into your inside of your local environment into that browser sandbox. But another thing is, of course, if you have something like HSDS, then why not be able to talk to this REST endpoint or even OpenDAP or something like that directly. And so yeah, great. Thanks to Andy, and so this is really inspiring, and yeah, I will definitely pick this up and do more good things with it.
Thank you, very useful. And suggestion, put tips, tricks, and insights first.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Maybe that's what we should do. Although again, the forum is just, it keeps a lot of, I mean, that's a good thing about, if there's nothing on the forum that might make you think nobody's using, either your stuff is perfect, which is unlikely, or nobody's using it. So the fact that there's traffic on the forum, it means people are using stuff, people are finding problems, and that's good. And we hopefully can keep up fixing them. But yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe we should alternate. Some days we should start with tips and tricks, and some days we start with the forum. Yeah.
Oh, maybe we can Twitter those tips and tricks just to raise awareness. Actually, I saw H5 was just recently. Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool work. Yeah. It's and NIST of all places picked it up, and yeah.
Well, they were using it for quite some time. They were very active in Nexus. I don't still participate, but they were very, very active.
Yeah. Okay. Time is up. Thank you for coming, and come back next time, and we'll see you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.